Hello. I have good news to bring, and that is why I sing. And this is the inaugural Quartet Conversation episode of Generally Particular, which is a production of the London Lyceum. And I'm not doing the whole rest of the intro because this is a different episode in Generally Particular lore. We said last time that we were going to do something different for our next episode, and here it is. We are installing what we think is going to be a great new conversation, the quartet. And joining me and Jesse are two of our previous guests, Casey McCall and Winston Hotman. So, today's discussion, administering baptism and fencing the table for the Lord's Supper. Now, before we get into this very deeply, Casey and Winston, remind our audience who you are. Go first, Winston.
I am Jake's friend, and no, I am an associate pastor here at Lake Highlands Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. Just finished up a PhD at Southern Seminary earlier this year, and working on revising that for publication. And I am married and have 5 kids.
And Casey, tell us who you are.
Yes, so I could actually almost repeat what Winston said. I am a lead pastor at Ashland Community Church here in Oldham County, right outside Louisville. I recently finished my PhD at Southern Seminary, December 2023, and I am married with 5 kids as well, though I bet mine are a little older than Winston's.
How old's your oldest?
He's 18, going to college next month.
Yep. My oldest is 11.
And Jesse? Oh,
Casey, Casey does not look old enough to be a father of an adult, but that's a good thing.
I appreciate you saying that.
And Jesse, how are things down there? You're gearing up for the semester to begin.
Yeah, the semester starts at Welch in just a few weeks. And so looking forward to that. Yeah, I did look up earlier, Jake, to see, because you always complain about how hot it is in Louisville. And I think it is slightly hotter in Louisville today than it is in Gallatin. So it is hotter there. So.
How hot is it there?
We were at like 92 and feels like 103. And Jake, what I pulled up was like 94 and feels like 105. So you edged us out.
We're at 98 down here. Feels like 101.
So I'm in a
nice cool summer day.
First of all, it's kind of a stretch to say that I complain about how hot it is. Like Jesse never complains about weather. I mean, please. Yeah, right. And but it has been pretty toasty. But you know what? They're calling for Saturday morning. It's supposed to be 62 here in Louisville. So I'm hoping that
nice.
That is not just the weather forecasters' a dream, but reality. So with that, we're really excited about this. I think this is going to be a fun kind of installment. We hope to do once a month. Of course, this could be the only time that we do it if we get bad feedback. But I don't think we will. So we're going to start off this episode talking about this quote. And this quote comes from both Jesse and Casey's favorite Baptist in history. John Gill said this. Now, we know that some people have said on the interwebs that if John Gill said it, then it must be, gospel truth that cannot be opposed. So, as I read this, we're thinking about Baptist ecclesiology and how do we understand the administration of the ordinances? So let me read this from Gill. Admission to baptism lies solely in the breast of the administrator, who is the only judge of qualifications for it, and has the power of receiving to it and of rejecting from it. If not satisfied, he may reject a person thought fit by a church, and admit a person to baptism not thought fit by a church. And then he says this a little later. A church has nothing to do with the baptism of any, but to be satisfied they are baptized before they are admitted into communion with it. Now, this is quite a striking statement because Gill is essentially saying that it's the pastor, the administrator, who almost seems to have the sole authority to determine who and who is not fit to be baptized. Now, in reading that, that sounds contrary to historic Baptist ecclesiology, and might I even say what the New Testament pattern is. What say you three? Let's start with Jesse, since he loves Gill the most. Jesse actually thinks this is spot on, and this is what he practices. So go ahead, Jesse.
Well, it's kind of funny because when Jake first sent this to me,
I didn't tell him who it was from. I didn't tell you who it was from.
I disagreed with it, but I said I can see some in practice. I could see some value in what's being said here. I kind of wanted Winston or Casey to go first on this. But yeah, I think the problem is if baptism lies solely in the breast of the administrator, then I wonder how the church kind of holds the keys, you know? And if he has the ability to baptize someone that the church rejects, or to refuse to baptize someone that the church approves, then again, I mean, he says it outright. It lies solely in the breast of the administrator. And I don't think that's congregational church governance. Now, I could add a qualification later where I think I could disagree with him on one side of this and maybe get a little bit closer on the other side. So it might be that I might feel a little more comfortable with saying that he might refuse to baptize someone that the church thought fit, because he didn't think that they were necessarily regenerate. But on the other side, I really don't see how you could qualify that as congregational church governance at all.
It almost sounds more like a Roman Catholic view than a Baptist view. And what I mean by that, I remember a few years ago, there was an article that I read where a priest had to resign because he had been using language in his baptisms of "we baptize you," like as a representative of the church. And so what ended up happening was he had to resign, and all of his baptisms were invalid, because he's supposed to say "I," meaning as the representative of Christ. I baptize you, because Christ is the one who baptizes you through the priest. And so Gill's view is more similar to that than to a historic Baptist view, in my mind, which is strange, considering Gill's own convictions.
We just need Winston to say he agrees 100%.
Yeah. So like I mentioned to y'all earlier, I took the time last night to read the whole chapter in which this quote is given. And I thought maybe it will add some clarity. It didn't really add any clarity. He kind of just moves on from it. I will say this, though. It's not the only odd thing that he says about baptism in that chapter. One of the points that he makes is that there's no distinction between John the Baptist's baptism and the baptism that Jesus commissions the apostles to administer. In fact, he argues that John the Baptist baptized in the name of the Trinity. So he's got an argument for why that's the case. I do know, though, on this particular topic, it might be helpful to understand at least, maybe the exegetical appeal that he makes. So he actually holds up Ananias's baptism of Paul as an example of Paul having undergone this conversion experience, meeting with Ananias, and then Ananias, without any sort of, consultation with a local church, baptizes Paul. And then presumably Paul is later added to the church. That's one of his arguments for it. His other argument is that when it speaks in Acts of those who were baptized, and then and added to the church. He holds the language there, the syntax, to be suggesting that there's a distinction between the act of baptism and some subsequent addition to the into membership in the church. This was my first time to really, dip my toe into his views on baptism. So, I was honestly impressed by some of the ingenuity of it, but also puzzled by some of those exegetical moves. But I've been trying to think in light of what else he has to say about baptism. What would lead him to this, and I haven't quite wrapped my mind around that yet.
Well, Jake, you should be at least in agreement on the John the Baptist part with your landmark history, right? The trail of blood goes all the way back to John the Baptist,
That's
if
an
I'm not
excellent point.
mistaken. Isn't that right?
Stanley Fowler, in his chapter on John Gill's view of baptism, makes that point. He's like, the landmarkists and John Gill seem to have this in common.
Well, first of all, there are a few Baptists in Baptist history that were not landmark that would have said that John's baptism and Christian baptism are linked together in some way. So that's not exactly only a landmark view, but is also would hold to in Baptist life. There's more than Gill that would hold on that.
Let me ask you guys this. Well, on that question that we were just discussing, what's the motivation for tying baptism back to John the Baptist?
Because
why is that?
Because it's showing that those who came to John were only baptized after they had confessed and repented. So he's tying it into the same with Christian baptism. There is the profession of faith and repentance. Then you're baptized. Okay. That's how John did it. So there's a correlation in that sense.
What one of the points that he also makes is really one of the major emphases, I think, of the chapter is to make the point that baptism is not a human ordinance; it's a divine ordinance. And to do that, he argues that baptism, as practiced by John, did not exist before John the Baptist. So he appeals, I think, to examples from like Philo and Josephus to argue that there's no evidence for this kind of practice beforehand, that this came directly from God and belongs to the, this new covenant age. And so he emphasizes the continuity with the church's baptism and a discontinuity with anything that's come before.
Yeah, see, that's the weird thing that he does is he makes that comment about it's a divine ordinance and not a church ordinance, which is that's where he gets it's fuzzy to me why he's making that argument. And then to go to Ananias and Saul, it's a little different because the Lord Jesus spoke directly to Ananias and told him to go do something, I certainly hope everybody's not having, visions and hearing things in their head that it's Jesus telling them to just go baptize people. I know Jesse, though, he's a little more charismatic than the rest of us, but,
Yeah, that's right. I believe.
Well, you go back to the radical Anabaptists, those weird people that Luther didn't like. So, yeah.
That's true. That's true. I don't know how long you want to talk about this from kind of thinking about Baptist ecclesiology, and then some of it's kind of practical too. Like Casey and Winston are both pastors. I just kind of wonder, thinking about this from a practical angle. So there's the congregational polity component, and for Gill, it seems as if the authority lies solely again in the administrator. And I disagree with that, and I don't think that's congregational church governance. But I do wonder, and maybe y'all want to give some input or maybe you don't. If let's say the congregation as a whole wanted someone or believed someone was genuinely born again and supported their being baptized, but you didn't think that they were, would you go the way of Gill and say, I can't baptize this person against my conscience? Or how would you handle that?
Well, that's quite a hypothetical, Jesse. You're a pastor too, so
Well, how about I tell you, I I wouldn't baptize the person. So I guess what I'm saying is I think in that instance, I suppose on the negative side, I'm siding with Gil, I suppose.
yeah, I can't go against my conscience. Like if my conscience is telling me that this person's unregenerate, there's no reason to baptize them. Um, then the church would have to decide either. I mean, at that point, I think you're running into a bigger issue. Like either I'm not your leader, I'm not the one called to lead you in these decisions. This may be the issue that proves that, or um, something's going to have to give in that situation.
Yeah, in our context, I don't think it ever come to that because as pastors, we're entrusted with the responsibility of evaluating a candidate for baptism, but as representatives of the church, based on a consensus as to what we should be looking for and things like that. And that's the weird part I think about Gil's view is like Jake says he's going to emphasize that this is not a church ordinance. He'll say this baptism doesn't happen in the church, it happens outside of the church because the person being baptized is not yet part of the church. And yet it seems like he glosses over the reality that this is administered by the church. And so I can't imagine that in his context, there are baptismal administrators floating freely outside of the context of local congregations. And so in our context, when we baptize, we're always going to be baptizing as representatives of a local body of believers. So, yeah.
Yeah, we're set up the same way in terms of, no one's questioning those decisions in our church, which I think is healthy. I mean, the church has given that authority to the pastors, shared that authority. I'm also interested in, and again, Gil's got a commentary on the whole Bible, so I'm very interested in what he would do with like the progression from Matthew 16 to Matthew 18 to Matthew 28, where you have Jesus building his church. The gates of hell won't prevail against it. Whatever you bind on earth, that language. And then you have that repeated in the context of the local church in Matthew 18, where, church discipline is being commissioned. And then you have, Jonathan Leeman makes this argument, Matthew 28 should be read in light of those two passages because all of the language is so similar, the authority, the presence of Jesus. And so the call to baptize and make disciples is to be interpreted in the context of the authority of the church. The binding and loosening is, the church deciding who's in and who's out. And so that to me is the strongest exegetical argument against Gill's view.
I agree with that. I do wonder, maybe Jake, you can give some input here because we talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago. I think when you first sent this quote to us. So my experience is the same. The church I pastor, again, it's kind of a delegated authority. I'm interviewing baptismal candidates as well as candidates for membership. Obviously, we vote on people who are joining the church. We don't vote to approve candidates for baptism. Now, I know some places when they baptize, they'll say baptized into the membership of the church. They're Baptist churches that frame it that way. So I don't know. There are just all kinds of practical components.
Jesse, when they say that, are they speaking like the church universal, or are they speaking of membership in their own local body?
I mean, I get the sense some of these are Baptist churches. I get the sense that they mean that almost as if baptism and joining the church are simultaneous, such that some Baptist churches, and I'm like kind of the 9 Marks, Capitol Hill variety, which I love, most of what they do, but they won't baptize people. Some of them almost till they're like 18 years old, because it's like you wouldn't baptize a person until they can join the church, be a member of the church. And again, I'm not saying that that's like a standard practice. But what Casey, what you and Winston have both described again is what the church that I pastor does. But it sounds as if some other Baptist churches, almost as if they would approve a person being baptized and joining the membership of the church almost as like the same thing.
Well, a few things here.
Sure.
Number one, Winston said earlier, first of all, Winston is the teacher's pet here. He read all this homework last night that nobody was assigned. So we applaud him for trying to read and understand Gill in his context. Winston said he didn't know why Gill gets in this place. I think it's because, and this may sound very simplistic, and I'm not trying to, impugn the motivations of John Gill, but Gill had a little bit of an authoritarian bent to himself on some things. And so I think, one reason I wanted to talk about this is because it floats around on, the internet and different places. You can find a couple of comments from Gill where he seems to favor some kind of more magisterial enforcement of, the first table of the law and things like that. I think that's consistent with Gill's personality, that he just was a little more bent towards like real authority being invested in one person. I think his whole way of talking about baptism here, and that it's the pastor who's making this decision, and it's almost like, it's my way or the highway in a sense, that fits a narrative. I mean, the saying was that nobody was married, buried, or ordained in London without John Gill being involved in some way. So he kind of was a little bit of a, Baptist Pope there in London in his day. Now, here's what's interesting. Now, way back when I was growing up.
Hey, Jake, just a quick question. I mean, can we assume that a baptism administrator would have always been a pastor in his context, or could that have been other members of the church?
Well, if you look back at the way the 1689 lays it out, it says that the ordinances are to only be administered by qualified individuals, which reading that means it would have been seen as pastors with probably deacons assisting them in some way. In this context, I can't imagine an administrator being somebody who was not a pastor of the church in that sense. So it could be, I couldn't foresee, somebody else doing that. But now back to it was asked about, nobody votes. Jesse said nobody votes on baptizing somebody. Tisk, tisk, we did growing up. So when I was growing up in our landmark church, a motion and second and vote was made whether to baptize somebody or not. So
I guess I'm just wondering if that's the consistent practice.
back in the homeland there, I mean, if you didn't do that, something was wrong with you. So, but I don't think that's necessarily the common practice. So at RBC, we don't vote on baptizing somebody. When somebody, there's a process, but that process of being baptized and considering that is because they're in the process of becoming a member too. So we read their testimony. They go through the membership classes. And then when they're baptized, then they come before the church and we read our covenant together. We covenant, they're received as a covenant member, and then we welcome them in. Now, here's something too. Let me throw this one out here for y'all. When I was growing up, when a person got saved and wanted to join the church, they were given the right hand of Christian fellowship. So we all went down and welcomed them. Then they got baptized, or if they were joining by letter, then when we got their letter from another church, then we gave them the right hand of church fellowship. So when we did the right hand of Christian fellowship, if you were a visitor, you could walk up there and give them a hug or shake their hand or whatever. But when it was the right hand of church fellowship, only the members of the church could go up there and do it. Now, Jesse, I bet you hadn't heard of that one, have you? No,
then
we
all
were
sorts
doing
of things
the
I hadn't
old.
heard
We
of,
were
so.
we were just retrieving the old paths, So
Jake, you and I had very similar backgrounds growing up. I'm guessing in the case of your church, part of why you voted as a church on the baptism of a candidate was the fact that there was no universal church. I mean, part of, I think, what's going on with Gill is, and others, is this, distinction between the church universal and the local church. But in our context growing up, there was no universal church. Baptism was baptism only and always into a local body of believers that then qualified you for membership in another body.
Of like faith
it was
and
baptism, not local church. Correct. Right. So is that kind of what was behind that?
I don't know if we had it that. I don't know if we had it that
reason for
well
voting
fleshed out, just the way that you put it. But
Gotcha.
But no, that's
Gotcha.
true. That would be true. I think, to add on, I think that what Gill is saying here, I think, goes against historic Baptist congregationalism. Like a lot of the guys who are applauding Gill's lines on the law and the magistrate, I think if I were to read this and say, not tell them who it was, just read this, I think 9 out of 10 of them would say, no, that doesn't sound Baptist. I would reject that. So we're trying to show an exercise that in Baptist history, because it is so diverse and interesting, you can probably find somebody in there who says what you agree with. But that doesn't mean that it's good.
Yeah. I mean, you can find anything in Baptist history, Jake. I mean, the Virginia Baptists, like in I wrote it down. 1774, the General Association of Virginia Baptists ordained 3 apostles. Elijah Craig was one of them.
Well, he drank bourbon. There it is. I mean, he invented bourbon, so
yeah. Well, he liked authority a lot too. So I mean, but my point is, like, it's the practice of, like, justifying any present use by being able to find it somewhere in Baptist history is not a sound way of doing theology. So
I think it's just a poor example too of how to be part of a tradition when all you're doing is scouring it, looking for something to hold on to justify, your contemporary view, rather than entering into dialogue with the fullness of the tradition and being shaped by the conversation as a whole.
Yeah, it's kind of like the story that I was told recently about somebody that recently left Baptist life, that basically he told somebody, if you're going to use John Gill, you need to be reading John Gill to find Thomism in him. See, that shows you immediately that you're not doing this properly and right. That's not how you do historical investigation and research.
Yeah. I think that's what we should be doing with everything, is just looking for Thomism in everyone. I mean, should be doing that in Spurgeon and Fuller, and
I
surely
don't
we
think
can
you
find
can find it in Fuller. I don't think Thomas is there, and I'm not sure if it's. I know Bernard is there in Spurgeon, but I don't know if there's any Thomas. Jesse talking about these. Casey talking about these Virginia Baptists and the Apostles. See, Jesse, that's why Isaac Backus and John Gannot had to go down there to those churches, because they were out of order and out of whack.
I immediately was thinking about the office of messenger among the English
thing,
General
extra biblical offices.
It's probably Elias Keach's fault. That's what I say.
Well, speaking of this, we talked about administering, baptism, but let's talk about administering the Lord's Supper. And I'm very curious to know, all 3 of you pastor, and of course I pastored for a time, so I had a way that I fence the table. I'm kind of curious, how do you 3 fence the table when you get ready to celebrate the Lord's Supper? Jesse, do you just say, "Come on up here, we welcome all"? Is that kind of the way you do it?
I think that's how John Gannot would say that we do it, but that's not how that's not how we actually do it. So when I fence the table, I fence it by saying that if you have been baptized as a believer and you're a member in good standing, with an Orthodox evangelical, I usually say Protestant, I suppose, church, then we invite you to participate in the supper. So that's the way that I fence it. Baptized as a believer, a member in good standing, and a member of an Orthodox Protestant church. So I don't really know what category that puts me in as far as approaches to fencing the table. It's certainly not just completely open, but it's definitely not limited to just members of our church either.
In Jake's estimation, I'm sure that puts you in the liberal category, Jesse.
I think anything I could have said.
I mean, just think about this. Jesse says, if you are Protestant, now, we are Baptists, not Protestants. So anyway, so there's Jesse's. Well, let me ask you this question, Jesse. Do you ever feel when I fence the table, I always, no matter how many times I administered communion, it always felt very weighty. Now, I think part of that was because of how I grew up. I've talked before about just how the Lord's Supper was treated for me growing up in our context like going to a funeral. I mean, it was very somber. It was not a feast. It was a funeral. I mean, it's almost how it's set forth. So it just always though felt weighty and just like administering and carrying this out.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It feels weighty. I mean, I don't think it has to be. If I can say Russell Moore's name on this show, I think I'm safe among friends. I remember him saying in the church he grew up in Mississippi that it was like a funeral. Like you had the white tablecloth pulled over, and it was like a funeral. But I think even if it doesn't feel somber in that sense, it still is a weighty thing. I mean, we think about some of the Apostle Paul's warnings in partaking of the supper. And then you think about your responsibility of shepherding these people who are members of the church that you're pastoring. It is a weighty thing. So, sorry, I was a little thrown off by the train passing through Casey's backyard there. So, yeah, I mean, I think it is weighty.
That's actually my front yard, but okay, yes, go ahead.
Okay. Train in his front yard. Did you ask something else?
Ask Casey, are you on the right side or the wrong side of the tracks?
On this issue, I would say
Okay.
I'm on the right side, Jake. But we're very similar to Jesse. I mean, we're not church members only. We fence it the same way. We do it every week. We say obviously if you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ and you've made that public through biblical baptism and you're an accountable member of a gospel preaching church, then you can join us. But on this whole somber, joyous thing, like we've tried really hard to emphasize the joy and celebration side. I think from my studies, a lot of the somberness comes from the interpretation on how to examine yourself, and I think that's misinterpreted. I think Paul seems very specifically he's talking about a church that was divisive and not loving one another, and that was the issue there. Not just are you a sinner, and I think we've made that into think really hard about your sin. Are you worthy to come? And which is the opposite of what we're celebrating. Of course we're sinners, and we come to the table with joy because our sins have been atoned for by the body and blood of Christ. So that's something we try really hard to overcome, those sort of that baggage that a lot of people have when they come.
What about where you are, Winston?
Yeah. So our church practices communion weekly. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to emphasize how the preaching of the word and the table are, represent the climax of our service. And we always, hold those two together. And so I think a couple of things, especially about the celebratory nature of the meal, is we see the preaching of the word and the celebration of communion as the climax of a service that has led up to that point. And so by the time we get to that point, we've already confessed our sins. We've heard an assurance of pardon. We have interceded with God, to God on our behalf and on behalf of our fellow believers in the world. And so typically by the time we get to that point, especially after we've now heard the gospel preached, it's just instinctually a celebratory moment. And one of the ways I think that we emphasize this as well is by often preaching to the table. So I like to call communion the original altar call, only because it's such a great way of applying a sermon. And then what we often do when we fence the table is use that as an evangelistic opportunity. So we our conviction is that the gift of the Lord's table is to anybody that we anticipate celebrating this with in heaven one day. And so we require that, somebody who's participating have been baptized in the name of Father, Son, and Spirit, and who are free to receive communion, in other words, in good standing in their churches. But we often, though, use that as an opportunity for those who might be with us that are not free to participate because they have not yet placed their faith in Christ or have been baptized, to make an appeal to them. And then in the way that we celebrate it, just the kind of music that we select and the ways in which we talk about it, we really do emphasize the celebratory nature, of this part of our worship. So
at RBC, it's fenced in the way of you're a believer who's been baptized, you're a member of a church that preaches the gospel as we do, and you're not under sanction by that church, then you're free to come. It's interesting to think back, like in my context growing up, that most everybody who's heard me on any of these podcast episodes knows, the famous or infamous burying the communion element story of my first 2 years pastoring. And, we did it on Saturday to make sure nobody showed up that shouldn't be here, which is because we were closed communion. It was only members. Now I will say, from a fencing standpoint, that's the easiest way of going. Because if you just limit it to the members of the church observing, then you're not going to have to really worry about, thinking through these other issues.
yeah, growing up in my church, we practiced it weekly there as well. And I think I mentioned this on the last time I was on the show. We also used wine in the Lord's Supper, which for an independent Baptist church was already a bit odd and offensive to some. So we always practiced it during our Sunday evening service, which was typically when we had no guests. And so it made it easier to do that as well.
I have to say, Jake's story about burying the elements, that's quite a story, but Winston, that is the first time I've ever heard someone say that they went to an independent Baptist church that used wine. I just thought those were mutually exclusive. I thought teetotalism and independent Baptist churches are like...
Jesse, there were a vast majority of independent Baptists that thought those were incompatible too.
Yeah. I've been enlightened today, though.
Yeah. But it was based on, and whether you agree with it or not, it was based on a sincere sense in which Jesus had not authorized something other than wine. Why would we assume that we could? And so there was a sincere effort at obedience in that restriction. But
well, Jake's church wasn't doing that. They weren't getting that literal with the Bible. They were fairly certain.
Well, that's because the wine that Jesus created at Cana was Welch's. That was not.
That sounds like some kind of liberal hocus pocus.
Well, that's how I preached it in those years. So I confess that. So, Casey, do y'all use wine or just regular grape juice?
We use grape juice, but we did go to one
Oh,
loaf. So we
Okay.
thought that that would give the the intent of what it represents with the one loaf. The one cup would be a hard sell. So
I was about to ask you if you moved to single cup.
no, we still use the little plastic shot glasses, but everyone comes up to the table and tears off the one loaf, and so that's how we do it now.
It's funny. We've had some people ask, why don't we do share a common cup? And I know that there was like a research studies done on this back during the pandemic that showed that there was extremely low risk of, passing something through a common cup, but that does not matter at all. If you're not used to it, no amount of scientific evidence will
so we
suffice to convince you.
use the little glasses, but little cup. They were glass. We actually use real glass little cups. So my mom and dad or I, washed those. That was our, when I was all that growing up and everything. And then now we always used unleavened bread. Like somebody would make, unleavened bread, and that's what was brought for the supper. I think that, when I think about, oh, and the common cup, I remember that I think it was when Dr. Haken came out with his Amidst Us Our Beloved Stands book that Jordan and Brandon interviewed Dr. Haken on the London Lyceum, and he shared that in the mid to late 1980s, he preached at some Baptist church in either England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, somewhere over there. And when he preached, it was their time to do communion, and they still used one cup. And I think he was weirded out by that experience. I mean, I have to confess, if I visited somewhere and they only had one cup up there, it'd be a test of faith to go participate.
Let me ask you this, Jake,
Yeah.
because you mentioned the glass cups. We use plastic ones here for our service, but we have a portable communion set that has some glass cups, which is what made me think of this. How do your churches approach that? Do you take communion to those who are sick or shut-ins? Is that part of what your church does or not?
We're about to hit a whole nother episode here.
No, we don't believe in last rites, Winston. No.
What if
I don't see.
I had
I'm gonna
someone
go
say,
Mark Dever here on you and all those things. Yeah, I mean, I know there's well-meaning people who do. I'm not trying, but I just think this is not the Lord's table. These things, the ordinances, are to the church when the church gathers, and that's when the corporate body meets. That's not when 5 of us are together, or 10 of us together, or 2 of us together. It's in some other location. It's when we gather together. So.
No, and I get the spirit of that, and that's why we make a distinction between those who choose not to gather and those who are
Yeah. So
one thing that we did
at RBC
illness
is we do communion twice a month. The first Sunday of the month, it's on Sunday morning, and the third Sunday of the month, it's on Sunday nights, because we do have some in the congregation who, for different reasons, can't be there for a morning service, so they can't participate. But they can be there on a Sunday night. And so that was done that way so that they would be able to, celebrate and participate. So I'll just say this, but I will say one reason we're talking about this kind of stuff on this episode, and we all would, agree with this. The pandemic in 2020 showed a lot of people did not have very good ecclesiology on this stuff because they never really thought through it. And it was just, whatever feels right. I mean, I still remember, I won't say the name, but I still remember seeing the video of a pastor of a very large Southern Baptist church saying, if you've got Kool-Aid and graham crackers, when we do this, that's fine. And just that's not how you do politics.
Yeah. I mean, going back to what my church did growing up and restricting it to one, we might look at that and think, man, that's just way too rigid. But there's also this other side, which is, what you get there. I mean, you don't have to be present at all with each other, and you can use whatever you want. I think most people would, well, I don't know about most, but many of us would agree that that's not
So
appropriate.
let's wrap up this episode this way. Guys, if you have one piece of counsel you would give to maybe pastors or laymen that are listening or watching this episode, what's one encouragement you would want to give to them about why the proper practice and administering of the ordinances does matter in the life of the local church?
Well, I'll let Casey or Winston go. Maybe I can just piggyback on something good they say.
I mean, for me, I think we could say a lot of different things, but much of what we were talking about as it related to Gil is the question of the church's authority. And the church's authority does not rise from within itself. It's gifted. It's given to Christ. We are representatives of Christ. And so to exercise that authority legitimately requires that we exercise it in a way that's faithful, that administers baptism, that administers the Lord's Supper in a way that's in keeping with his words, with his teaching, the teaching of the apostles. And so I just think it's, if you have a high view of the church in that way, that this is something more than just a sentimental gathering of believers to mutually encourage one another, but actually, understanding our representative role in the world, then taking seriously what we've been entrusted to do and do it the right way is important.
Yeah, I would just say I think there's a tendency, and you guys know this, and we would all agree on this. There's a tendency to put pastors on a pedestal, and you have celebritism, and I think that every chance we get, we need to be teaching our people that the church is the authority, and that's been given by Christ. The keys are handed to the church, and it takes a lot of teaching because there's a lot of nuance to that. I mean, obviously the church then is entrusting the pastor to lead and make decisions day to day, and all of that's true as well, or the pastors, as I think we would all agree in the health of a plurality there as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that we've got to combat that mentality, and I think it's pretty deeply rooted in a lot of our churches.
Yeah, probably just taking these things seriously it may be foreign for people who've grown up in mega churches. Maybe fencing the table at all is something that they're not really used to, at least not in a significant sort of way. But one of the things that I've been most helped by in the things that Mark Dever, Capitol Hill 9 Marks have put out, as well as others who've taken Baptist history and the Baptist tradition seriously, is when we take membership and discipline seriously, and that includes things like baptism and the supper, it is intended to not only maintain the purity of the church, but also to give people a deeper sense of assurance of salvation in the gathered body. Not only do I think that I'm right with the Lord and maybe have that inner witness of the Spirit bearing witness with my spirit, but also the common sense of these people who know me the best, hopefully, affirm that I'm a believer as well, to the best of their ability.
I would just add that having a richer understanding of the ordinances in the sense of the ordinary means of grace, presence of Christ in his church, really brings, I think, helps show why this matters. I think one of the great things that Baptists got wrong for a lot of the 20th century, parts of the 19th century, was that when we wrote about baptism and the Lord's Supper, we spent most of our time explaining what they were not, and we didn't always give a very positive case for what they are and why they matter and why they're important. So I think this has been a great conversation, and I've enjoyed it a lot. I don't know if any of our audience realized what I said when we started the episode, that I quoted from an old hymn, but I close with the words from that hymn: "If too much fault you find, you'll be sure be left behind." Winston knows that, right? Winston, do you know what hymn that is? You don't know
I'm
that?
not familiar with that one.
Jesse.
Think so.
I don't either.
Casey's not going to know because he doesn't know anything about Southern Gospel. That is from the old gospel ship. I'm not going to sing it right now, but anyway, I think
I'm gonna take a
I'm
trip.
going to take a
That
trip in the good old gospel ship.
on the good old
Yeah.
gospel.
Good old gospel.
Yeah.
I just must not know that verse. Okay.
I think I know the chorus to that
Well,
song.
now that you talk about that song more and share more of the lyrics, I'm confirmed in my decision to stay away from that type of music.
Well, we'll close the episode like we do close our normal, generally particular episodes, and it brings more weight with things that have happened in the larger evangelical Baptist sphere over the last week. So, stay Baptist.
Stay Baptist.
Come on, you two, say it.
Stay Baptist.
Stay
Of
Baptist.
course,
I didn't realize it was
especially you,
supposed to say
Winston.
it. Sorry.
We've got to make sure you say it.